Alright, hey there everybody. I wouldn't normally make a video on something like this, but there's a really upsetting situation going on in my alma mater that I'd be remiss if I didn't bring some attention to. My name is James Lillen, I go by Pax on the internet, and I graduated SUNY Fredonia with a triple major in English, acting, and women's and gender studies. I could not pick just one traditionally gay major, so I had to go for all three. You may have seen a lot of talk about SUNY Fredonia in recent days. And although judging by the coverage, you would be totally in your rights to think that Fredonia looks like this, or maybe like this, it's also a really lovely campus with some really wonderful people. It also, notably, has one particular edgelord that has plagued the campus for over 2 decades and is now making national headlines again. That's right, baby. It's the king, Dr. Stephen Kershnar. Let's go. This video will be about Stephen Kershnar and his recent interview on Jason Werbeloff and Mark Oppenheimer's YouTube channel, Brain in a Vat, that has blown up all over social media and been in dozens of news publications. I'm going to talk about what Kershnar said and why it's wrong, give you some context for why he's tenured in the first place, tell you about his history of abusive behavior with students and professors, and finally talk about if he actually can be removed and what we could do to push in favor of it. During my time at SUNY Fredonia, I worked at the school paper and did many extracurriculars, and am still very close with a lot of people on campus. For this video, I interviewed dozens of current and former students, teachers, administration officials, and what I uncovered was, to me, even more shocking than what's been in the headlines in recent days. All agreed to speak with me under anonymity, but I managed to cross-verify nearly everything that I'm about to tell you in this video with multiple parties. And I know that this video is long, but trust me when I say that it's going to be worth it. Just as a heads up, this video is going to touch on some pretty upsetting things, and there's really no way I can get around that. The subject of this video has ridden on everything from slavery to pedophilia to abortion to defensive torture. While I didn't personally have classes with Kershnar, I am someone who has had the displeasure of knowing this professor, watching him debate, interviewing him at various times, and I'm also personally a survivor of many wonderful various forms of child abuse. So this story is a little bit personal to me. Because I have a personal connection to this situation, I'm hoping that I can help clear up some of the context behind it. So let's get into it. Take my gentle hand. Up to a gentle land. I'm a gentleman. So to get it started, right at the top, let's take a look at the initial video that started this entire controversy. With over 6,000 retweets, the initial clip of Kershnar on the Brain in the Vat podcast delivering his thoughts on pedophilia.
Imagine that an adult male wants to have sex with a 12-year-old girl. Imagine that she's a willing participant. A very standard, very widely held view that there's something deeply wrong about this, and it's wrong independent of it being criminalized. It's not obvious to me that is in fact wrong. I think this is a mistake, and I think that exploring why it's a mistake will tell us not only things about adult-child sex and statutory rape, but also about fundamental principles of morality.
Holy shit, Stephen. Wow. It is not hard to see why people are upset from this. I don't need to give you a essay on why people might not have liked hearing that, especially considering that this is a professor at a state-funded university, you know? A university which, by the way, many students start attending when they are minors. And for most people, this is enough. This is where the story ends. And if that's where you want it to end for you, I don't blame you. Speaking personally, the visceral reaction that I had to hearing that was to, with every inch of my body, want to load Kershnar into a trebuchet and launch him into the nearest volcano. Alas, my siege weaponry was recently repossessed. Thanks, Joe Biden. Shut up, Jesus Christ. So I dug deeper, and for a second, I paused. I looked at the account that initially tweeted this and saw it was from the Libs of TikTok Twitter account, a far-right anti-BLM Twitter account whose other footage is mostly videos of fat people crying, women with blue hair being pushed downstairs, and unarmed black children being loaded into black market trebuchets into the nearest volcano. I paused and wondered, could Kershnar possibly have been taken out of context? Was he giving some weird devil's advocate argument that got clipped and discovered by the libs of TikTok? The short answer, no, he wasn't. And the long answer is like, oh my God, Jesus Christ, it's even like way worse than that? He said even worse things? What is happening? Before we get into what he said, let's briefly talk about who Kershnar is, because it'll be very important for you to know. Kershnar is essentially a professional shit stirrer. He loves diving into incredibly controversial issues and not just taking the devil's advocate position, but arguing as if he's the literal devil. His books include For Torture, A Rights-Based Defense, Pedophilia and Adult Child Sex, Total Collapse, The Case Against Responsibility and Morality, Gratitude Towards Veterans, Why Americans Should Not Be Very Grateful Towards Veterans, and The Physical Manifestation of Wordle Pounds My Butt is a slightly frustrating but ultimately rewarding and meditative daily routine. Kidding. That last one isn't by Kershnar. It's by Chuck Tingle. Kershnar could never write a book that good. So many people, upon hearing that, would go, what the fuck is Grindelwald teaching at Fredonia? I don't blame them. Like, I was an edgy kid myself, but like, I'm also not a 50-year-old tenured college professor earning $90,000 a year to like, just ask questions, dude. This isn't the first time he's gotten in trouble on campus either. And there's even an article called The Kershnar Cycle Reactivated, and people in the field seem to be aware of this pattern where every few years Kershnar publishes something especially outrageous that breaks out of the academic philosophy circle and into the broader world at large and causes headlines. Kershnar was known on campus as the philosophy teacher who loved to push buttons while being an outrageous contrarian, which can like actually be a little valuable in a philosophy class. If you've taken any class on argumentation, you know like a way lesser version of this guy. Now, when it comes to very taboo subjects, most people are just comfortable saying pedophilia bad, racism bad, sexual coercion bad. And if someone responds to that with like, why? Why? Do you have like a citation on that? Can I like see like your articles and like evidence backing that up? Then you rightfully would presume that they are a dick. Or worse, a libertarian. Why this can be academically valuable, especially in a higher level class about philosophy or argumentation, is that when you're writing very seriously about thoughts and morality and logic, it can help to be forced to defend your position at every level and to count out the steps. It's like a way more fucked up version of the write out every step in how to make a PB&J problem that you might have been given in elementary school. The point being that yes, all of these horrible things are horrible and we know that they're horrible, but devil's advocate, let's practice the arguments and have really difficult conversations so that we can be ready to have them out there. Now, here's the thing. I'm actually really sympathetic to people who want to have serious conversations about taboos. I mean, like, Lord knows that we have them enough behind closed doors in gender scholarship spaces. I think that writing on difficult subjects and researching taboos should, in general, be protected. If the quality of the writing and the research is serious, thorough, and compelling, then even if I don't agree with the author's conclusions or goals, I'm in favor of letting it out there. Fight speech with speech, etc., etc. That said, Kershnar is much less a professional academic than he is a gigantic troll. I've seen him debate, and a former professor of mine once described his argumentation style as more like a lawyer than an academic, and I think that sums it up pretty well. He likes to ignore nearly every substantive argument that's against his outrageous positions and then slap people around with like truly galaxy brain hypotheticals. To understand what's going on in his head, we should touch upon two important theories of ethics. Those theories being act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. Oh, wait, please don't go. Okay, I promise I'm gonna make it super quick. So, the difference between rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism boils down to this. Rules utilitarians generally believe that an action is right if it conforms to a rule that leads to the greatest good. But act utilitarians generally believe that a person's act is morally right if, and only if, it produces the best possible results in that specific situation. No person needs to think only according to one school or the other, and often the rules that rule utilitarians suggest society be organized by are arrived at by considering all of the angles through act utilitarian thought exercises, and then making an internal judgment about what laws would best help minimize harm in society. Like age of consent, Steve!
And we don't care what they say. And
so, arguing from a act utilitarian perspective, if we imagined 1 million people who suffered from child sex abuse, one might say, Oh, but what if there was a 16-year-old boy in that group who had sex with an adult and he actually thinks it was pretty cool, huh? I'm so smart. Gotcha. Now, Kershnar loves being a devil's advocate AU goblin for the most part, but his recent controversy, in my opinion, isn't even that. It's him baselessly and cruelly arguing in favor of decriminalizing child molestation. Before we dive into what the worst argument I've ever seen from Kershnar is, I'm going to give you an example of an article that's emblematic of most of his published work. So, published in the Journal of Social Philosophy in 2003, that's right, baby, I'm talking about
the Certified Hood Classic. Damn, son, where'd you find this? That's right, it's
a liberal argument for slavery. So, important caveat here, Kershnar himself can best be described, as far as I can tell, as a right-wing libertarian. But when he says liberal here, what he means is the notion that preventing unjust harm from happening to others is a good reason, and in fact, the only reason for state coercion. So like, laws and stuff. It's not what most non-philosophers would come up with, but like, hey, you do you, king. So in our brief examination of a liberal argument for slavery, I'm naturally dramatic. And because I find personally Kershnar too boring to imitate, I'm going to debut a new character with the clothes and costumes I have on hand. So I'm going to be delivering his arguments as a character that I feel captures his essence, called Incel Dumbledore. Hey, Professor, you said you're making an argument for slavery, not like a thought exercise or a defense of? What do you mean?
Well, if you were going to go to prison, would you rather face the death penalty or become a slave forever to the person who you wronged?
What?
Well, you see, you could make light-up sketches for 18 hours a day in a sweatshop and give the victim's family your money. It's mutually beneficial.
That sounds like a really specific and deranged setup. How about slavery as it, like, actually exists in the real world?
Oh, well, as long as it's not the result of unjust coercion, then it would be quite good, actually.
What do you mean slavery not as a result of coercion?
Well, like, what if you were really into the idea of becoming a slave yourself? It was like your thing.
Wanted to?
Well, what if you lived in a terrible shithole country and some really cool rich real estate tycoon offered to move you to his, where your standard of living would be so much higher, the only downside being that you would, of course, have to be a slave forever.
Okay, these are insane hypotheticals. You're arguing in favor of decriminalizing slavery and then allowing government-protected slavery statutes to be put into law?
Checkmate, lib!
Isn't the value of self-determination more important to protect than these nightmarish, contrived outliers would be?
Fuck no! Because giving up all of your future labor and freedom would be so much more valuable. Plus, think of all the sweet meals you'll get from your slave master.
Well, because we live in a society with laws, can the slave who chose to enter the contract ever choose to exit that contract?
No, dummy, because then that wouldn't be valuable. It's only valuable if it's for keepsies. No fingers crossed or takesy-backsies. Plus, the government should enforce mandatory slave contracts that you enter yourself into forever.
Professor, I don't want to sound like a filthy deontologist here, but don't we have a duty as sentient beings to preserve the option of reasserting our moral agency?
Shut the fuck up!
What?
I said shut the fuck up! Let me ask you a fucking question. Do you think that terminally ill people should be allowed to pursue euthanasia over a painful and slow death?
I guess?
Oh, okay, Snowflake, let me just get this straight. So you're okay with people giving up the future ability to choose on account of them being dead, but not on account of them being slaves? Check fucking mate! I win. Yes, I win. Kershnar wins. I am the logic king.
This is going to be a pain in the ass to edit. These are the literal arguments that Kershnar makes in his paper, and a few things of note here. One, Kershnar is deliberately inflammatory. to an extent that barely even reflects his argument. To name the paper a liberal argument for slavery, instead of a defense of or a justification of, is clearly meant to outrage and mislead. 2, Kershnar wants to give you like clickbaity, trolly food for thought, but the ideas and scenarios that Kershnar whips up in the paper and in much of his other published work, it just isn't particularly interesting or valuable or thought-provoking, at least to me. They're all on the level of, oh, you think that putting your dick in a pencil sharpener would be bad? Well, what if I were to tell you that what if there was actually a guy that like really liked that actually? Ooh, boom, baby, checkmate lib. I've owned your whole belief system. Your morals are in tatters. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Third, the arguments themselves are just like, not good. Kershnar wants to be edgy and thought-provoking like the South Park guys, but his arguments are also incredibly specific and poorly formulated. His complete lack of honest engagement with the defense means that every sentence of his comes off as a form of linguistic autofellatio. And this is a trait shared in most of his writing and, as we're gonna get into, most of his interviews.
Florida has asked us to disclose our sexual crimes to you. We were bad, but now we're good. We're moving into your neighborhood. You know we're trying our best to be functioning members of society.
So, giving Kershnar the benefit of the doubt, let's start by examining his performance in the now legendary Brain with a Vat interview. I know what you're thinking, but James, that video was deleted for violating YouTube's terms of service on account of all the pedophilia it was saying it was good. It's lost to us forever now, we'll never get it back. Well, I downloaded the whole goddamn thing before they had a chance to remove it, so I'm so sorry, Steve, you're not getting off the hook here. And in honor of not taking him out of context, let's start with the very first opening volley of the podcast.
Welcome to Brain the Vat. Today we are delighted to be joined by Stephen Kershnar from Fredonia State University in New York, and we're going to be talking about sexual taboos. Stephen, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Imagine that an adult male wants to have sex with a 12-year-old girl. Imagine that she's a willing participant. A very standard, very widely held view that there's something deeply wrong about this, and it's wrong independent of it being criminalized. It's not obvious to me that is in fact wrong. I think this is a mistake, and I think that exploring why it's a mistake will tell us not only things about adult-child sex and statutory rape, but also about fundamental principles of morality.
Wow, this is bad. Kershnar's defenders have been pointing to the opening line, asking him to share a thought experiment. But the way that Kershnar responds and phrases it throughout the entire interview, the thought experiment ends after, imagine having an adult having sex with a 12-year-old, and then carries on to share that his personal view is that it's a mistake to assume that that situation is automatically wrong. So immediately one of the hosts counters with, well, how do you react to the argument that a child can't consent? Of course, and I can't believe that I have to say this, but when most of us make the argument that a child can't consent, we don't mean that they can't literally say or believe or be coerced into saying the word yes. We mean that we, as adults, don't believe that a child has the requisite tools, development, or understanding to give informed consent. So, yeah, sorry, you don't get to have sex with them. Dude, come on. Kershnar, shocker of all shockers, feels like super different about this, guys. So let's see his response to the consent argument. And if you think that he was being inflammatory before, oh boy, this is a whole different level of dumb.
So they might say that a 12-year-old just can't be willing in that situation. They don't understand what sex is. They don't have the requisite knowledge. They don't understand the consequences. And so they're not really willing to engage in that act because they don't understand what they're willing to engage in.
Sure. So there could be two ways someone could structure this objection. They might think that children can't be willing things in general. It's an odd view in that they seem to will things all the time. They will participation in kickball. They will showing up, participating in the bar mitzvah lessons, bat mitzvah lessons. So there's all sorts of things that they will. You might think, well, maybe there's something distinct about sex that they can't really understand it. It's not clear to me that what they're not getting at is consent. I suspect what they want to say is, okay, they're willing participants, they're voluntary participants. They have some understanding what's going on, not understanding we do, but some understanding, but they haven't consented. Perhaps that's so, but that's a different claim from their being unwilling. There's just lots of activities that children engage in that they don't understand all that well. For example, when you first show up to participate in a judo tournament or you prepare for your bat mitzvah, I mean, you have a rough idea, but it's not clear how much you fully understand it.
So you might have missed this because of how much was going on, but what a ginormous evasion of the point, as is typical Kershnar. He boils down anyone's objections to pedophilia as two straw men that he constructs through deliberately misunderstanding the spirit of the host's point. And then he proceeds to barely even engage with the straw men that he just made. He tosses in some deliberately inflammatory statement about comparing a child getting to play sports or prepare for a bat mitzvah, before just shrugging off any genuine engagement that molesting a child might be like a little worse than making them play basketball. The host then tries to pin Kershnar down on age of consent laws, and boy howdy does he drop a doozy here.
So the problem with the consent aside is if consent were set aside, then it's unclear why we could do anything with children. Why is it that we're able to make them to go to their sister's ballet recital? Or why is it that we have them run cross country or take certain classes or have certain medical treatment? So if consent were really necessary, it's not clear that we could do anything with children, and especially those things that are not in the child's interest, like go to the family Thanksgiving ceremony. So that's kind of a high bar. It would rule out most of what we do with children.
So this is one of Kershnar's worst abstractions, which in my opinion, the hosts just do not do a good job of countering. Kershnar's insistence that, oh man, if we can't bang children who really want it, then we can't do anything with them, is like, wow, get the trebuchet ready. What's wrong with you, dude? This is also where he starts using the same argument that he makes during a liberal defense of slavery, in which he consents that like, oh, well, yeah, I guess if you're gonna be a buzzkill, it'd be bad if the children were forced into doing it, but like, if the child consents to sex, then we're all Gucci, baby. Forced slavery is bad, but voluntary permanent enslavement contracts would be super lit. He then tackles the host's question about consent, and it leads to the slippery slope argument to end all slippery slope arguments.
And with regard to American statutory rape law, I think you're being way too kind. American statutory rape law is just all over the map. Depending on the state, the age of consent is 18, 17, or 16. Some states have Romeo and Juliet laws, which mean if you're in a 3-year or 4-year window, you're protected. Some don't. It's just all over the map. Some punish it harshly, some punish it not at all.
Of note here is that age of consent laws are not like, oh wow, they're all over the map. They're all in the same ballpark, all right? It's not like in Brooklyn, I can't have sex in my own apartment because the age of consent is 27, but then I could go to the corner store 3 blocks down and buy a bushel of toddlers to just stack on top of me like a Jenga tower. When we ask in any situation, well, where do we draw the line? The answer isn't, good point, give me that kid. It's somewhere. We draw the line somewhere. But Kershnar just like smirking his way through giving arguments like,
so follow the map, and then you have all these bizarro paradoxes. You have cases where 2 people can both be convicted of statutory rape for having sex with each other. Or a man has sex with his legal wife, takes a video of him having sex with his wife, and he's now convicted of federal child pornography statutes. So I mean, these statutes are all over the map. They're inconsistent. They're pursued at a very uneven manner, and they're sentenced in a very uneven manner. So, well, I think you make a good point that American statutory rape law is vague. It's worse than vague. It's just all over the map.
And oh boy, Jesus Christ, does he slip some doozies in here. In regards to his outrage about not being able to indulge in our God-given right of filming ourselves having sex with our child wives, he's deliberately obfuscating things here. In the US, states without a minimum age for marriage law, it instead falls to US common law, which lists the minimum age for marriage as 12 years old for a girl and 14 years old for a boy, which like, I'm like not even gonna get into here. But the situation that he's so outraged by is one in which an adult is married off to a couple's child and then films himself having sex with that child. Steven looks at this and then decides that the great injustice here is being arrested for making the tape. Like, wait, what are you, R. Kelly's defense lawyer, Steve? I have a friend who went to Fredonia who, when she was younger, experienced a very, very fucked up situation with her parents marrying her off as a minor, and I cannot even begin to describe the harm and incredible damage and evil in situations like this. And he teaches philosophy. He then uses the fact that so few statutory rape cases are prosecuted as an excuse to defend pedophilia as a whole.
On one estimate, there are 7.5 million instances of statutory rape that occur every year in the US, and only 0.2% a tiny fraction come to the attention of the law enforcement. So follow the map.
This is just so strange to see a tenured doctor of philosophy making this argument. Again, I know I don't have to spell this out to you, dear viewer, but using the fact that so few people are punished for doing a thing as grounds to say that ergo we should decriminalize and not worry about the thing is just like faulty beyond belief. Like, I would expect a freshman to do better here. Rape is not okay because so few rapists are incarcerated, and neither is any other hard-to-track crime. The host then goes, okay, Steve, well, surely we can get you to acknowledge that there's some blanket age where this isn't okay, right? And like, I don't know, just watch this shit, man.
Right. So there's a couple things to say here. One is, even if you are looking for a threshold, let's say there's a threshold. I'm making this number up, but let's say it's at age 8. Still, that tells you that some adult child sex is permissible. Second, the notion that it's wrong even with a 1-year-old is not quite obvious to me. There are reports in some cultures of grandmothers filleting the baby boys to calm them down when they're colicky. If this were to be true, and again, I don't know it to be true, if it were to be true, it's hard to see what would be wrong with it.
The good old, it's not quite clear to me that having sex with 1-year-olds is wrong because I heard about these African grandmothers who suck babies' dicks that may or may not exist defense. A classic. This is like quite literally on the same level as the guy who likes sticking his dick in the pencil sharpener argument. Curiously, I could not find any substantiating information that this phenomenon of African throat goat grandmas exists. Oh, curious. I wonder why. Let's continue.
So, yeah, I guess I think, no, I don't think there's a blanket period beyond which this is permissible. If we're interested in willing participation, which is the way I structured it, then yeah, there's a point below which people aren't willing participants in anything because they don't have intentions or they don't have the sort of mental states that allow for willing participation. But no, I don't think it's blanket wrong at any age.
So here he argues that maybe there's a period so early in development that a baby literally can't make decisions about anything, but even then there's no blanket rules for whether or not to have sex with them. Fellas, if she has object permanence, she's a thought. They then go on to discuss the philosophical difference outlined by David Benatar about casual sex versus significant sex. These aren't two different types of sex, but rather two different views about the fundamental nature of sex. Is sex the same as any other pleasure, like going for a run, or eating a box of chocolates, or reading the new chapter of the hit manga Reborn as a Vending Machine, Now I Wander the Dungeon? That's the casual sex view. Or is there something specific and special that merits unique treatment of it as a pleasure? That's the significant sex view. Steven rejects the latter and then hits us with another
banger take.
There's no right infringement. But even if you thought there was some other function, like it's degrading or it's exploitative or it's objectifying, it's a little hard to see how any of these are present that are not present in other activities. There's not really a transaction here, so it's not really exploitative. As far as objectifying, I fail to see how it's different than a wrestling match or a judo match. And you're participating with someone for some activity. What else would distinguish the two? It's hard to see that it sets back the well-being of either individual, so it doesn't seem to be a bad maker. So it's hard to see why it's bad, but even if I'm wrong about that, usually what's meaningful is the idea that you take pleasure in those things that are worthy of pleasure. Well, this begs the issue, right? It begs the question, why isn't this worthy of pleasure? So I guess I think it's not wrong, it's not bad. I don't think meaninglessness is a real category, but if it were, it's probably satisfied. So I just don't think that Benatar's approach is correct.
So lines like, what else would distinguish the two? I fail to see how it's any different than a wrestling match. It's hard to see what the wrong maker is here. It's hard to see what's bad about it. Why isn't this worthy of pleasure? These are all approaches that have clear and distinct counter-arguments that are so simple that even somebody without a single philosophy doctorate under their belt could whip up a pretty clear counter-argument for it. So I'm not going to dignify this by spelling it out point by point. But again, I fail to see, it's hard to see, why isn't this worthy of pleasure? These are all phrased in the most intentionally cruel and ignorant and provocative way possible, which is a trait mirrored throughout all of his other academic efforts. Kershnar then goes further to not only point at outliers, but to then wrongly insinuate that adult child sex isn't harmful by referencing what is, in my estimation, one of the most widely debunked studies of all time.
It's actually quite murky. There's a pair of studies by Bruce Rind and some others that kind of looked at the long-term consequences of adult child sex. And what they discovered is something like, and again, these studies are highly controversial. Roughly about 74% of males reported they had kind of a positive or neutral view after, and I think 45% of females, this is well after, reported like a positive or neutral view. And then anecdotally, things are all over the map on this. And same thing with the people who engaged in statutory rape during their teenage years. It's just not clear that these things do have negative consequences in general. And it's even worse because you might think the negative consequences are in part affected by the negative views society has for these things, right? In the same way that society has very negative views towards interracial relationships, there might be a certain amount of suffering or pain because of disapproval.
It cannot be stressed enough that all of the research into molestation and child sex abuse, coercion, sexual violence, all of it, finds it devastatingly, unequivocally harmful and damaging to the minors involved. Not only that, but if you follow the science in the journals, you find that new research is coming out all the time about long-term trauma from instances of child sex abuse. So like, as an academic, this might be the part of Kershnar's arguments that like almost offends me the most. Because Kershnar cherry-picks details from a piece of really faulty science. Its formulation is so infamously bad that like I would put it up there with like Wakefield's vaccine autism study or like Blanchard's theory of autogynephilia, which says that trans women are really just men who are so horned up by the idea of women that they want to become one so they could get horny at themselves. It's like, this paper's really, really bad. It's a study that one should be like, boom, discredited for citing. And one that shows that Kershnar is not really interested in what is true, or what is real, or what's good for the victims, or what's good philosophy, or what's a good argument. So, what's so bad about this study? Why do I consider it decredited? Where do I even fucking start? So Kershnar is citing a meta-analysis study done in 1998 by Bruce Rind of Temple University, Phil Tromovich of the University of Pennsylvania, and Robert Bosserman of the University of Michigan. I'll refer to it as the Rind study here moving on, but remember these other people were involved. They concluded that the harm done by child sex abuse was really just harm done by prudish adults freaking out about it. So everybody should like chill out, crack open a 12-year-old with the boys, put on the game, it's all good, man. The problem is they deliberately engineered the study to ensure that the way that they manipulated and cherry-picked the data would give them exactly what they were looking for. This is going to take a minute. Please stay with me because it's important you understand just how bad it is to cite something like this. To start, they only looked at child sex abuse studies done using college student participants, which is not representative of all the people that are abused as children. This creates a strong systemic bias in favor of those who suffered less negative outcomes from abuse or recovered more quickly. Especially in 1998 when like way fewer people went to college, you're getting, on average, people who had the greatest economic, psychological, community, and educational resources available, which decreases the long-term measurable psychological and behavioral damage. That's enough to raise a red flag about their conclusions, but wait, there's a lot more. The study only looked at average symptom severity, which naturally fades year by year. People can slowly heal from trauma, and the average measurable symptomology will naturally be lower, like 5, 10, 20, 25 years after the original instance. Harm that only causes serious damage to a child for a few years is still damage. It's still harm, and ignoring that is malpractice, in my opinion. On top of that, initial trauma can morph into long-term issues with behavior or processing that over time can become abstracted and harder to identify as related to the initial trauma. Shout out to all my mentally ill homies out there. Let's go. Let's get this back. Let's try to untangle this childhood, baby. Ah!
Hey, shout out mental illness. Shout out mental illness.
Researchers know this, even back then, and this is standard stuff, but Rind ignored it. Rind also only looked at studies that defined CSA with maximum broadness, which can be good in certain contexts, but in this context, they identified simply being propositioned as a equivalent instance of child sex abuse to actually being assaulted, and that pulls down the averages even more. The studies also only used self-reporting, which, like, again, okay for many studies, but they have well-known problems leading to systemic underreporting of stigmatized trauma. People don't want to remember horrible things, and many even minimize the impact of childhood trauma as a coping mechanism many years later. We all know this, almost like intuitively, but Rind chose to ignore this. All right, 2 more. Throughout the whole paper, Rind chose not to correct for the well-documented problem of underreporting of abuse experiences in their study selection or in their analysis. Men are much less likely to report sexual abuse experiences, despite being, as we now know, more or less victimized at the same rate as women. This might even be shocking to you now to hear this, but this is what recent studies show, and it's certainly a phenomenon that I felt. They even went so far as to report that low self-reported rates of psychological symptoms meant that men experience less harm from child sex abuse than women do, which again is like baseless malpractice. It's like evil. If you remember having some intuition that boys are more resilient to being propositioned by adults and in some cases may have even enjoyed it, science like this might be where you get that from. Last thing, but maybe the biggest thing, even in 1998, the psychological community knew that overall functionality was a key part of measuring psychopathology. It was even in the DSM. Rind didn't care. They selected studies that focused only on specific individual symptoms, which sent rates plummeting even more. The final nail in the coffin was the individual symptoms that they did select for, focusing exclusively on internalizing symptoms like anxiety and depression rather than on externalizing symptoms like hyperactivity, low attention focus, aggressive behavior, academic underperformance, and risky physical and sexual choices, which again drastically misrepresented male victims even more than female victims. So, let's add it up. Any one of these would be enough to throw the entire study's legitimacy into question. But when you factor in all of these issues, deliberately done by authors to engineer pro-molestation results, you don't have honest research. All you've done is accidentally succeeded in writing the pedonomicon. Kershnar chose to cite this, and he chose to deliver the throat goat grandma story, and he's a distinguished professor. These are professors that are meant to represent SUNY's finest. He is a vicious debater when it comes to his tactics. But as a writer and a public intellectual, he is so unambiguously incompetent and horrible that it's honestly hard to feel like his actions are anything other than intellectual malpractice. His conclusion, because he's lied about all the research and the harm done by pedophilia, is this.
Here's a rule of thumb. If you don't know whether something has expected good or expected bad consequences, the thumb on the scale should go to liberty.
So, what is Kershnar doing? Is he just asking questions? Is he just challenging taboos? Is this a thought exercise? To me, at least, it certainly doesn't seem that way. He's a bad writer, a lazy thinker, a dishonest and manipulative contrarian who is less interested in having a complex debate than he is in laying out the most dishonest, wrong, and outrageously worded arguments and then stepping back and going,
What's the matter, guys? Too challenging for you?
It sure as hell just doesn't feel like he's just asking questions. Especially when you see clips like this of the pure, orgasmic glee that he takes in giggling about this topic.
I think, look, we make children do all sorts of things that we don't want to do. Right?
Thank you.
You know, we make them go to church. We make them go to the temple. We tell them to go to school. They got to go to the dentist. They got to go to their sister's ballet recital. And we don't care what they say. And they want to do things. We say no, right? They say, I want to stay up and watch, Creature Feature on WPIX until, 2 in the morning. We say, well, it's tough.
That is all a child's life is coercion.
Right, that's right.
Is coercion by adults and often to make the child do something for the adult's pleasure only.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You say, you're going to go to your great uncle's funeral, even though you want to go, and even though it's not in your interest.
It feels like he wants to deliberately mislead, deny, gaslight, and obfuscate the truth, just so he can say outrageous things. There are real academics willing to have really tough conversations, even on this subject. But Kershnar completely ignores the other side, peddles pedophile apologia, and in this situation is just going completely Joker mode. People are mad when they see this, and not a single teacher or administrator that I spoke to, and I spoke to a lot of them to research this video, is anything other than disgusted and heartbroken about this situation. People hear this and yes, congratulations, Stevens, you got got what you wanted. People are triggered. There are so many victims of child sex abuse and people whose lives have been affected by it, and people who are just disgusted by this. He's speaking up on a public podcast syndicated all over the internet, with none of the traditional trappings of a thought exercise, no qualifier, no acknowledgement of any good reason why it might be bad to have sex with children. There is no good reason to behave like this. He's a professor at a publicly funded university earning $90,000 a year, and it feels like a violation on every level. He's not engaging with this like a serious academic. He's Mad Max style spray painting silver paint all over his face and yelling, "Witness me saying pedophilia is actually really cool." It feels like an abdication of any responsibility. And honestly, it just feels cruel. Philosophy students who are victims of CSA might have classes with him. Many might even be minors themselves attending classes with them. And I'm not particularly interested in making minors attend classes with Professor Pedo Bear. And in terms of whether or not Kershnar himself is a pedophile, I'm just going to quote one teacher who spoke with me who I think framed it excellently.
I personally don't know whether or not Kershnar is a pedophile. All I am certain of is that he is a galactic dickhead.
The counter-argument is, well, it's not illegal to be a dickhead. Ad hominem, ad hominem.
Facts don't care about your feelings. I have free speech.
The response nationwide has been split, with over 15,000 signatures on a change.org petition calling for Fredonia to fire this man. My Facebook and Twitter feeds are filled with people who are outraged, saying Fredonia and SUNY are defending a pedophile. And I understand why this is so triggering and so upsetting. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, came out in support of his right to speak freely, with over 100 professors nationwide signing a letter urging for Kershnar to be protected, with articles like the Kershnar Cycle Reactivated describing Kershnar's formula that they've been watching for years. 1. Publish an article like, "Slavery is lit, torture is awesome," or another certified hood classic, "Let's go, trapaholics."
Damn, son, where'd you get this?
That's right. The classic, "It's quite moral to only be attracted to Asian women, and God is my witness, nobody will stop me" article. 2. Wait for headlines and outrage. 3. Free speech, rinse and repeat. Tensions are high and everybody is suffering. People want the Fredonia president to just snap his fingers like Thanos and disintegrate Kershnar's position. And I don't blame them for that. The thing is, he just literally can't, and why he can't gets into a frustrating and fascinating event that person after person referred to me in Fredonia history. They speak about it in hushed tones, like it was the last time the Chamber of Secrets opened. The last time that the Kershnar cycle really hit nationally. The tragedy of 2006, we're going to dive into a really important question that not enough people are asking. How the fuck did this guy get tenure?
Edgelord, I'm Edgelord, I'm so edgy, wanna F me, okay F you, I don't need you pushing me right to the edge. I live in a society that's always lashing out at guys like me.
Alright, so before we get into the details, it's important to understand the unique relationship that a university has with 1. Tenure, and 2. The right to free speech. Both are critical, and both are also sort of a double-edged sword. Free speech and First Amendment protections are normally incredibly important to a university. They're often at the cutting edge of pedagogy surrounding civil rights and social justice, and they are the place for every idea and angle to be discussed. Great thinkers can accomplish great things with great liberty. It's kind of the idea of it. Sometimes, however, there is a downside to this, and a bad actor takes advantage of the guarantee of liberty and comes to school every day in full-face Joker makeup screaming,
"What's the matter, guys? Too challenging for you?"
Sometimes, a Kershnar slips through. I'm not going to get into the overall debate surrounding tenure here, but there's no doubt that it can be valuable. Many professors entering academia as adjuncts or associate professors are paid pennies on the dollar for the classes that they teach. And tenure is the oasis in the desert of pedagogy that very few teachers manage to reach. To obtain it usually requires a record of quality research, quality teaching, and quality public service. It's a common misconception that tenure is a lifetime guarantee of employment. It isn't. It's a guarantee that you can't be fired without due process and an investigation. Most professors who earn it are excellent. Sometimes, however, there's a downside to this, and tenure is granted to a professional troll who has all the right people on his side and checks all the boxes. Sometimes, a Kershnar slips through. So this is going to be like the spiciest portion of the video, because a lot of this for you will be completely new information, and I think this is where the story kind of starts to change. What follows is my best approximation of the events of 2006 that I can piece together. I can't guarantee that everything played out exactly as I'm about to describe, but again, I have interviewed dozens of professors and administration officials, both current and former, many of whom were there during this time. They all spoke to me anonymously, but a lot of them agreed on this, and because of that, I am really confident in the story that I'm about to tell you. I've heard some pretty dire and upsetting claims, but in general, I'm only going to be presenting information that I have been able to verify and back up from multiple confirmed sources who were there at the time. So, Kershnar joined the faculty of SUNY Fredonia in the late 90s, and faculty at the time described him as generally thorough, willing to question Republican Party orthodoxy. One professor described him as MAGA before MAGA, but in general, although there were definitely red flags at the time, most people agree that Kershnar chose to wait until after he was tenured to unleash his truly most deranged writings. Which, like, smart move. We did get articles on the adult child sex topic, rape porn, the benefits of torture, anti-immigration, anti-affirmative action, etc., etc. Now, peer review is not perfect. The discredited study from Rind et al. Earlier, that one was peer-reviewed. The process is pretty good, but again, sometimes a Kershnar slips through. There's a lot to disagree with in the articles of his at this time, and I think a lot of his arguments are still like quite bad and pretty poorly reasoned, but they were still peer-reviewed and published. Plus, this was the era of edgy debate lords like Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins, so it didn't really feel out of place at the time. Now, Kershnar was acknowledged by all as a vicious debater, and he had been trained as a lawyer, as a degree in law. He argued like a pit bull, charging straight at the opposition and ripping them apart. Many people found him quite thorough. Others found him to be a dishonest, manipulative jerk who was poisoning the discourse. But he was a product of his time. Most of the rest of the Fredonia philosophy department was also a product of its time. We're talking edgy middle-aged professors, debate-obsessed new atheists, old angry conservatives. They often caused headaches for the rest of Fredonia, but there were a few good apples. Tenure at SUNY Fredonia involves meeting this list of criteria. In terms of how it moves along, it takes roughly 7 years, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, to be elevated to a tenured position. The school trusts the peer review process to determine the merit of a work. The administration can't, in the tenure application process, take a peer-reviewed article presented as a professional contribution and say, well, this guy seems like an asshole, so no, they gotta take it. The person in question also needs to be elevated and recommended by the other faculty in their department, which then moves along to the department chair, who then sends the recommendation to the president, who then forwards that recommendation to the chancellor of SUNY. If everything's going well, I'm pointing to the chancellor of SUNY. But this is the current one, not the one from there. Unless I found the one from there. It's somebody. Somebody's going to be over here. Now, I'm simplifying things slightly, but in general, this is the order of operations. Kershnar had published papers, and he had the philosophy recommendation down. And here's where a little extra spice comes in. The philosophy department at Fredonia had become notorious at the time for its questionless support of its own members. As an example, and this blew my mind, every tenured faculty member of the philosophy department at Fredonia had the Distinguished Professor title, which is SUNY's highest academic rank. Multiple people I spoke to alleged, and this story seems true, that the older conservative professors at the time in the philosophy department slowly took over the Distinguished Professor nominating committee. Multiple people that I spoke to describe a situation where Kershnar received the Distinguished Professor title because, at the time, older conservative professors from the philosophy department had slowly taken over the committee that handles nominations for the Distinguished Professor title, and then worked nominating and advancing each other, one by one by one. The president is essentially forced to hold their nose and forward the committee's recommendations to the SUNY Board of Trustees. And if you look at the letters written at the time, the letters of recommendation, you can tell that there's this strange difference between recommendations that were clearly an enthusiastic recommendation passed on by the president and like when the president was like holding their nose to let the letters through. Even more screwed up is that Kershnar himself personally headed this committee at some point. And I have multiple reports of professors joining the committee while Kershnar was the head of it, only to be directly told how to vote on the committee by him, with at least one professor quitting in protest. Kershnar would go on to receive every academic accolade that SUNY and Fredonia had for faculty, including the Chancellor's Award and the Hagen Award. He checked all the boxes. And as a person with a background in the law, he knew how to fight, how to argue, how to gum up the administrative works and stonewall if he didn't get his way. He was a vicious debater, and people knew that when he was ready to dig into a fight, that he would use every dirty trick and rhetorical twist and misrepresentation in his book to get what he wants. So when administrative laws and red tape are already so much to deal with at a university, and you have a job to do and classes to teach and things to run, why fight back? But here's the tea. In 2006, somebody tried. Fredonia's president at the time, Dr. Dennis Hefner, was being driven up a wall by Kershnar. See, Kershnar had been publishing articles in the Dunkirk Observer this whole time. The Observer is a conservative paper with a small but passionate readership, located in Dunkirk, which is the town next door to Fredonia. Although in most of his peer-reviewed cases and papers, he didn't get the chance to, flat out lie, that wasn't the case for his articles in the Observer. They were opinion articles. There was a lot more leeway. And ever since he started, he was generating terrible headlines for Fredonia, and the problem was only getting worse. He'd go on screeds against affirmative action, against leadership. He would claim that men are hardwired to rape, and that existing rape statistics were lies. He claimed that there was a declining quality of students at Fredonia as more minorities were being let in. He was against limitations on student-teacher sexual relationships, etc., etc. He criticized Fredonia's spending on arts and environmentalism and speakers brought to campus. He would use wild half-truths and way out of context information for his articles, but as a lawyer, he always made sure to stay just on the right side of libel laws, just on the right side of the First Amendment. And this is one of the core things that has let Kershnar stay at Fredonia as long as he has. He knows how to balance just on the knife's edge. But in my opinion, this recent time, he may have finally gone too far. So what happened? Well, President Hefner was principled in saying that Kershnar's opinion articles did a disservice to campus. But the requirements for tenure do not include collegiality and vetting of on-campus sources for opinion articles. And Kershnar was up for tenure that year, and his department was behind him. Tenure as a whole is guided by SUNY law and processes, guidelines from the AAUP, that's the American Association of University Professors, and various teachers' union agreements, and yada yada yada. Now, the legal jargon for both tenure and unions is both intentionally dense in some places and intentionally vague in others, which allows for a decent amount of room for bad actors to slip through. Administration is often afraid to speak up or call bad actors out for fear of a lawsuit, and I honestly don't blame them. Most of SUNY is underwater financially, and teachers and administrators are struggling to keep their jobs and funding already, so, a lawsuit really is the last thing that they would want. But in 2006, Hefner was pissed, man! And in doing so, he made a miscalculation. See, he didn't want to give tenure to Kershnar. Very few people in the administration did. He and Kershnar talked about what Hefner called deliberate and repeated public misrepresentation that impugned the campus's reputation. But Kershnar started setting trap cards. Kershnar himself suggested to the president at the time, well, why don't we predicate my promotion on the institution of a two-person panel that will review my statements for a year? And if at the end they don't find anything out and out incorrect, then my promotion will go forward. Now, this is the trap card. Hefner got drawn into this proposal and in doing so countered with a more formal system of prior review that would apply to all of his writings on campus for a year. Also asking him not to discuss the matter in public, and then boom!
Sorry to disappoint you, Yuki. Huh? You triggered my trap card!
Got him. Kershnar then went to AAUP, which are normally very generous in defending professors. But even they thought that he didn't have a case. So he went to FIRE, that free speech organization that I mentioned earlier, and shared with them all of his public and private correspondence with Hefner, and the backlash was immediate and intense. Dr. Dennis L. Hefner admitted that engaging with the proposal and responding was a mistake. But it was too late. All over the country, headlines sprung up about Dennis the Menace, decrying his attempts to silence and censor Kershnar, to predicate his promotion on aligning with the panel of censors, a move antithetical to the goals of the First Amendment and free speech and expression. As one article, Dennis the First Amendment Menace put it,
The American Association for Unprincipled Pacifists was underwhelmed by the magnitude of the prior restraint issue in Kershnar's case. After all, he wasn't writing for the New York Times. So he turned to the only organization that defends both left-wing professors and right-wing professors. I am talking, of course, about the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Fire used their media arm to blast Dr. Hefner all over the country, and hundreds of letters were sent in through Fire's letter writing campaign from people who were absolutely furious. Dennis the Menace fell for the bait, and in doing so, he became a national poster child for free speech being censored by snowflake libs. And teachers and administrators all across Fredonia were harassed and pressured, negative headlines going national, with the hard-working faculty left behind to pick up the pieces. Kershnar would still be invited to meetings with the president, vice president, and the dean to talk about the situation, but Kershnar arrived not intending to talk. Instead, he arrived with a full contract of demands, demanding his promotion and demanding to be placed on 2 different academic boards. And hey, guess who has 2 thumbs and is dope at investigative journalism? This bitch! I obtained an original copy of the contract that Kershnar drafted, which reads to me like an incredible instance of bullying and extortion. You can pause the screen now if you want to read it for yourself. Of note here is that this is not a signed contract. There was, as far as I can tell, a blanket refusal to submit to his terms. An outrage that the process felt like one more reduced to blackmail than a continuation of the academic standards that they all swore to uphold. The administration refused to make secret deals, and the process proceeded along properly. But here's the thing. Nonetheless, Hefner really didn't have the grounds to refuse. Kershnar's colleagues, many of whom are no longer at Fredonia, and his nationwide peers who passed him through the peer review process, they were all still standing by him. So after the explosion of headlines, the outrage, the letter writing campaign, the following year, Kershnar was put forward again by his colleagues, and this time, he was granted tenure. The Kershnar cycle would go on to repeat every few years. A new paper, a new outrage, but that's the last time I can tell that the Kershnar cycle reached its apex on a national scale. So ultimately, what's done is done. There is no closing Pandora's box, and he now has the protections and prestige that is offered by tenure. Interestingly enough, ZipRecruiter lists the average salary of a clown working in the United States as $44,000 a year. And by that metric, Kershnar is earning almost double that of his peers, so things are working out pretty well for him. Congratulations, King. So before we talk about how to get rid of a professor with tenure, we need to remember that free speech is protected by the First Amendment. He'd need to be really, really bad at his actual job to get removed, right? Oh, his job? Yeah, come to think of it, how is he at his job?
My lady is gentle, my lady is kind, my lady she loves me, my lady she's mine, my lady is sexy, my lady is pure, my lady is chaste, my lady's a whore. My lady can't find her, my lady's not real, my lady's a dream, my lady's a deal with the devil, a very good price, the price of my soul, my heart is like ice.
This has been one of the most difficult parts to research. And again, I've talked with a metric ton of former and current students, and I've heard a lot of really painful things. I want to start this out with a broad strokes of what students seem to agree on. Both sides tell me that Kershnar is a brutal teacher, love him or hate him, and a lot of his colleagues attribute this to his law school pedigree and the sort of hazing techniques of law universities back in the early 90s. It's disorienting to learn from him. In general, you're never really sure where you stand or where he stands on any given topic. He'll begin class, even on day 1, by launching into an incredible screed on one topic, giving no context or indication that it's not his personal beliefs. No hello class, I'm Dr. Stephen Kershnar, here's the syllabus, and in which you'll find this and this and this. The next class, he'll be a completely different person, and he'll dismantle the arguments from his previous class bit by bit. Let's start out with the people who love him. I only heard from 2 of them, but in general, I know both of them to be kind, excellent, brilliant people. Of note here is that no matter what side the students who reached out to me were on, whether they were pro or anti-Kershnar, whether they thought he should keep his job or lose his job, they all argued their positions excellently to me, which tells me that if nothing else, Fredonia's English and philosophy departments are doing a pretty good job of teaching writing. So his fans describe him as a fascinating, dynamic professor whose true beliefs you're never quite sure of because of how convincingly he would argue and lie about and then change his own position. They point out that questions questioning sacred beliefs is one of the core things that makes an education in philosophy so valuable. And the intense and engaged style of his teaching kept these two people really engaged and focused, constantly growing, considering new angles. In class, Kershnar wouldn't assign essays. He'd instead host debates in class. You could write essays if you really wanted to, but in general, it was highly discouraged by Kershnar. So the students that liked him acknowledged that the debates were intense and that students were directed to go at each other very aggressively, but they found the pressure cooker critical to their development as arguers and thinkers. They spoke glowingly about him as an educator, and they felt like he was invested in their success. One of the two students who really loved Kershnar thought that he should absolutely not be removed, and the other was conflicted about what his fate should be, considering what I'm about to describe. I don't want to discount the perspective of these two students, and I certainly understand the concept of thriving under pressure. And to be honest, thriving under pressure is probably how Kershnar himself would choose to frame and defend his own techniques. But here's the thing. In terms of literally everybody else who contacted me, it was a different story. Of the other students who contacted me, having learned under Kershnar, they not only felt like Kershnar should be removed, but they felt like he was responsible for incredible amounts of anxiety, breaking people, and holding court in a way that felt terrorizing in the classroom. So, a lot of this is going to be hard to hear, but let's get into it. So, starting with the least offensive end, and keep in mind this is like the least of what he did. So let's talk about one year that the administration processed a remarkable number of first-day dropouts from Kershnar's class, which I suspect was not an isolated incident. This particular semester, the dropouts were initiated after Kershnar spent all of the first day of class launching a derogatory screed against the existence of God. It was careless and cruelly phrased, and it resulted of a lot of students of faith dropping out after feeling attacked and demeaned. I start out with this because questioning the existence of God is one of the core and most common debates in philosophy. But I urge you to remember how Kershnar chooses to frame all of his arguments. He aims to offend, to hurt, to belittle. He's academically lazy in his arguments. His arguments are aggressive but badly formulated. I think a lot of Kershnar's debate style is built on using the most offensive, derogatory, cruel terminology possible so that then you feel so shocked by the outrageous framing, like you're watching an episode of South Park instead of talking to a doctor. And then he uses that opening as an advantage to slip in the most lazy, half-assed arguments, and you're too busy trying to figure out what the hell just happened to even notice how lazy he is as an academic.
That's my job. I'm a stand-up comedian. I'm meant to challenge people. If you don't like being challenged, don't watch my shows. What's the matter, guys? Too challenging for you?
He's often accused of ignoring the basic tenets of logical reasoning and indulging in just backwards and flawed syllogisms. He was probably a dick, but that's protected under the Constitution, and the world out there is going to be cruel and mean to you and belittle you and destroy you, so get ready for me to do that to you as practice now and for you to pay me for the honor of doing it. With segues and introductions to the arguments that he makes, it could be a valuable illustration of how arguments are built. But instead, I heard multiple stories about students leaving class in tears who didn't get the point of the lesson. And I don't blame them. And those students who left in tears usually don't complain because they just, at that point, wanted to put everything behind them. So moving down the iceberg, a different professor described to me the nervousness they would feel from some of the students who were speaking publicly in class. When the professor in question encouraged them to speak at their own pace and in their own way, a student approached them after the class, saying,
"Oh, this is way different than my philosophy class, where any sign of weakness is like blood in the water. The professor always mocks the weakness and goes after it."
So what did they mean by that? So not only did Kershnar organize forced debates in his class, but he mandated a very strict formal dress code, which many students described to me as sexist and classist. He would pit students against each other in a way they would describe as,
class was like a ruthless dogfight in which the goal was to break the other person, to destroy their arguments, and if they got in the way, them.
And at the end of every debate, and I can't believe how many people told me about this, at the end of every debate, Kershnar would make the 4 student debaters line up and force the entire class to ridicule and rip apart their personal appearances and clothing. Everything was on the table, from your weight to misplaced hair ties. It sounds like a nightmare. One student said that he would demote your grade if you didn't participate to his liking. Students report comments like these.
You look poor.
Your shirt makes you look fat.
Your pants are so ugly.
Your shoes are out of fashion and your pants are unkempt.
They felt like Kershnar would foster a few students like him and revel in glee as they proceeded with the bullying. One student said to me,
"Most of us just grit our teeth and said things like, maybe you could have ironed your pants."
One student with anxiety shared that,
The thought of standing up at 10 a.m. and having my peers call me ugly and unkempt was terrifying. So I spent $80 on clothes getting ready for that class. I was so upset about it. And I returned most of it after, I think, but I know other students had similar experiences. His tests were impossible on purpose. He just sucked. He was just there looking for reactions to his shocking remarks, but most of us knew he was just a prick who was given too much power over a group of kids.
Besides enshrining belittlement and cruelty into the day-to-day experience of attending his class, there are just so many stories about all the little things that he would insist on, even when not related to the topic at hand, like...
He had this insistence to argue against the concept of women lawyers on the utilitarian grounds that a woman, via the nature of her reproductive abilities, was a less valuable lawyer over the course of her lifetime compared to a man.
And I heard this one from multiple people, and I urge you to give me a good academic reason behind this.
We had to watch all of A Clockwork Orange, and he'd fast forward through the movie so we'd only watch the torture and rape scenes. He would very condescendingly tell students before he pressed play that if they couldn't handle it, they could leave the classroom.
Like, man, what's wrong with you? These are people here to learn. There was even this one student who talked glowingly about a different professor at SUNY Fredonia who they told me was able to make devil's advocate arguments in a way that still fostered safety and learning and all those things you want students to feel, before saying, in regards to Kershnar,
You can analyze problematic material in an academic setting without the average onlooker assuming you're a racist pedophile.
So where were the complaints? Well, there was a ton. Like a letter one student sent to the Department of Philosophy head, talking about Kershnar's poorly sourced and formatted articles in The Observer, and saying that they felt like they were a disgrace. But nearly all complaints were resolved at the department level, as is procedure unless, and we'll get into this in a second, certain particular charges are made. And students talked, students complained, but everything about Kershnar's behavior discouraged much formal reporting. If he was willing to destroy you in class for going against his views, dismantling you piece by piece regardless of the merit of the argument or the research or whether or not you had it coming, well, you would be overwhelmed and put away. Most people didn't want to fight this. They were there to learn, not to lead a crusade. His behavior with his coworkers was in line with this too. He'd harass people constantly through the departmental listserv, examples of which for anonymity I'm not going to share here. So for the sake of brevity, we're just going to go through a list of things that I heard and was able to verify from multiple sources about the way he treated his colleagues. Let's go through it rapid fire. Loudly arguing with a female coworker who was more widely published than him that she would never have been published if she wasn't a person of color. Insisting on eliminating school guidance discouraging professor-student sexual relationships. Arguing that his coworker was trying to impose your Victorian ideas about premarital sex on the campus. Arguing amongst colleagues that men are hardwired to rape. Arguing with coworkers about eliminating the age of consent. Publicly releasing the salaries of POC coworkers in departments that he argued publicly should be eliminated, which is a dick move, but it's cool when I do it. And finally, another banger from K-Dog, launching into a unprovoked tirade at a department party about how the Nazis had every right and were morally correct for euthanizing the mentally handicapped. And that is just the stories that I heard again and again and again. Trust me when I say that there were a lot of individuals with one-off stories about how Kershnar was not very fun at parties. So after getting a taste of what the students and faculty at Fredonia have been going through when dealing with this person, we're finally going to reach the most important question of the video, which is how the hell do you get rid of a professor that has tenure?
But I make a solemn vow that when I have kids of my own, I'll break the chain. You'll see, I'm gonna live forever.
So I just need to start this off by saying that there are a lot of really good reasons why a person would choose to not file a complaint. And if you ever want somebody to file a complaint about an experience they had, but they don't want to, you do not get to make that choice for them. We need to respect the experiences of victims and protect them first and foremost. Now, of all the reasons to not report somebody for something, I've lived through most of them. And the choice about whether or not to report an experience rests with that person and them alone. But that said, I want to share with you a story that I think is important here. So, the year is 2017. I'm a staff writer for The Leader, which is Fredonia's school newspaper. A recent controversy just came up regarding what would be known as the abusers list. The long and short of it is that on the wall of the women's bathroom at BJ's, which is a popular local town bar, students had started writing a list titled Abusers at SUNY Fredonia. The list contained the names of people who had, allegedly, committed sexual assault. You can read about the controversy and the discussion it sparked by looking up the article, but I'm not going to get into it right now. The point is that in my own op-ed, I had shared one of my own experiences about being sexually assaulted on campus. How I chose not to report it, and many people reached out to me afterwards. One of them was a member of the university police at the time. So I met up with this person, and they shared their own experiences about what I had written about in the paper. And what blew me away is that they were incredibly knowledgeable and incredibly kind. Moreover, they were an expert in the ways that a student can seek justice in the wake of a sexual assault. And this discussion actually formed the basis of a seminar I gave my senior year on how to seek justice in the wake of a sexual assault, the different things available at SUNY. So I talked with this member of UP for a really long time, and then for some reason it occurred to me towards the end of our conversation, just like out of the blue, to ask about a particular person. Now, this particular person was well known as a serial rapist amongst my class. I think we all kind of know what that experience is like when someone's walking around the campus and it's like, watch out for that person. The thing was, this person was just wildly terrible. I personally knew of 3 women that this individual assaulted, and I knew of at least 4 others. So when I asked this individual I was talking to about his name, I expected them to not know anything about it, but it turns out that his name and the stories of what he did were really well known by this member of UP. And even they had heard the rumors and stories about him. As they reacted to me saying this person's name, their face washed with grief and pain and anger and concern. They knew about this person. They had heard stories. They even told me that, to the best of their knowledge, that this person just seemed to never ever respect being told no. And their face twisted in even more pain as they described that there was just nothing they could do. Despite hearing of him again and again and again, hearing details, hearing gossip, secondhand stories from students, despite all of it, not a single person came forward with a complaint. There were no reports. They understood the reasons why any one person wouldn't want to come forward and go through the pain and the processes of filing a report and the violation of dragging it all up again. They understood all this and they were very respectful of this, but they were still incredibly affected by their inability to do anything without a complaint to go on. And the thing is, I get it. I never reported mine either. But it did change something within me. I hadn't thought about this for years. Until recently, when I was talking with an individual who would be in the know and told me that through all of their years working with Stephen Kershnar, that there had been not one actionable student complaint submitted against him. Again, to repeat that, not one student submitted a single actionable complaint against him through the proper channels. Now, this person told me that students may have discussed their trauma from him at the counseling center or gone to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion office to discuss their objections to his views and his rhetoric and his articles and his papers, but not a single actionable complaint was submitted through the formal channels to start an investigation. So far, what has Fredonia done? Well, I don't know the results of this vote, but I do know that the University Senate, who, again, have been terrorized by this dude for years, voted on this motion condemning Kershnar on Monday, and it makes some fantastic points. One point that I hadn't considered was that university professors and teachers in New York State are mandatory child abuse reporters, a trait that is also shared with many who are training to become teachers at Fredonia. New York mandates that certain professions report suspected or known child abuse to a New York State hotline, the number of which you can see right here. Kershnar himself is subjected to this rule as well, which makes it incredibly worrying to think about what he might do upon learning about a case of actual sex abuse to a child. What this resolution doesn't do, however, is, well, anything other than express the pain and disappointment felt by the faculty at SUNY Fredonia. Again, there are laws and processes behind tenure, and they just can't be circumvented, especially not at a public university. Current Fredonia president, Dr. Stephen H. Collison, let the student body know that Kershnar has been directed to stay off campus as they investigate the matter, and that he may not contact students while the investigation is ongoing. Students are protesting all around the campus, with new students feeling especially violated about the recent headlines. And there are discussions about allowing students to drop Dr. Kershnar's classes and replace them with different classes without a fee or penalty. Because the philosophy department is so small, however, some students may have to take his class if they want to graduate on time. Even this, however, the president has had to fight for. After digging into it, it looks like much of what he's allowed to do is governed by the 1911 miscellaneous provisions of the contract between the United University Professors Union and SUNY, which says that prior to the completion of the aforementioned guidelines of investigation and due process and resolution of grievances and yabba 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 yabba, the college president may direct the employee to perform an alternate work assignment at an alternative location for a limited time. Again, I had to read a lot of shit to dig this up, so thank you so much to the Fredonia English department for giving me the mad skills to parse this bullshit. Now again, I'm not a lawyer like Big Daddy K, but what this doesn't seem to do, at least to my eyes, is to blanket prevent him from coming to campus. So how did that happen? Oh, well, looky here. I have an email sent directly to Kershnar himself by HR Director Maria Carroll, which Kershnar leaked to fire himself, but now I have it. Whoops. So yeah, looks like the woke anti-child fucking mob is after Kershnar yet again, and the protection is on taxpayer dime. But from what I can see, the reason why he's being asked to stay off campus isn't because the president can just send his ass to the shadow realm whenever, but rather because of the current level of threats being leveled against him. I do not endorse sending threats to Kershnar or Fredonia, by the way, but it is what the situation is. So, big question. How does a tenured professor traditionally get fired? Because after all, as Kershnar himself once said, "We live in a society!" And tragically, that society has laws. Well, here are some of the main reasons, all of which need to be investigated and sent through the proper channels, and given their due process with the teacher having the ability to hire representation. So, drum roll please. Significantly diminished functionality. You're getting up there in age and your decreased functionality is so obvious to everyone that you just called Cowboy Bebop that there Chinese fellow with them saxophones. Failure to fulfill the terms of his contract, not meeting with your classes, not providing grades to his students, violating the employment policies of the university, unethical or unprofessional behavior, violations of the faculty handbook, plagiarism, falsified experiment results, coercing undergraduate students into sex, and so forth. This is the hardest one to prove and prosecute. Calling your black colleague the gamer word? Probably off the table, but saying that your black coworker would never have been published or gotten her job because she's a person of color, it's probably free speech, but like, come on, you sound like such a dick, dude. The program you teach at is being eliminated, so your job is gone. Philosophy department in Fredonia is really small, and it actually was on the chopping block a few years ago, but it wound up not happening. Or finally, you did crimes. Like, if Kershnar were to take his Joker act to the subway, that probably wouldn't fly. And here's the thing, no matter what complaint is filed against Kershnar, he will fight his ass off. Class is too high pressure? Well, coaches have been doing that for years, so it's a legitimate teaching strategy. You're mad I said pedophilia is cool? Well, I didn't say that you have like a moral obligation to like go do it right now immediately, so that's not incitement. First Amendment, baby! Kershnar does, tragically, know the bounds of his contract. The thing is, a lot of people have made some pretty good arguments that this time Kershnar slipped up. He might have made a mistake. Can the cycle be broken here? So the fact that he'll argue his ass off, it doesn't mean that he'll win. And as a student recently said in a Leader article describing the situation, the students are in control completely. They can stop taking his classes and withdraw from them, stop going to his classes and peacefully protest around Fredonia, have conversations about it, etc. I want to remind you of the person who told me that in all of their time working with Kershnar, not a single actionable complaint had been filed against him. Now, I'm not telling you to not sign the change.org petition or not to tweet about it or not to post about it, but I mean, I'm angry too, I get it. But the fact is, at the end of the day, Fredonia just literally can't consider your tweets or the change.org position as evidence against him. When so many hardworking, innocent people are suffering, telling many of them that they're defending pedophilia just because this one asshole who they've had to suffer with for decades is back on his old bullshit again is just like, not ideal. It's just taking the hurt that we feel rightfully from this situation and shooting it at the wrong place, and that just isn't fair. Especially when they want this to happen more than anybody, but they can't do the things that'll make it happen. Only we can. So, what can SUNY Fredonia consider? Well, it needs to be a signed complaint with a specific charge. Something sent through email or regular mail that has your name and your contact information on it. And the complaint can't just be, he said things that hurt this group, but it could be an allegation of some specific bias that could be investigated. The university is required to investigate all charges of discrimination, criminal activity, failure to meet professional obligations. An anonymous letter can't be followed up with or considered. It's just hearsay legally. People can't be fired for their opinions, but the impact of their actions can be investigated. And if you submit a complaint, it will be. So what can you complain about? Well, a lot of people have pointed to this section of New York law and said that maybe demonstrating poor moral character is enough. But read close enough and you'll see that it only applies to individuals who have New York State teaching certificates, which is just not the case for many professors at the university level. So maybe you feel like Kershnar's actions demonstrated a specific bias, that he's failing in his duty as a teacher. Maybe you've had class with Kershnar and you felt like there was bias in his evaluation of you and that it damaged your academic career. Some complaints might warrant investigation from the university police or from the Title IX representative, as they may involve potentially criminal activity like stalking, sexual assault, or in the case of Title IX, rhetoric and action expressing personal discriminatory beliefs that you may believe rises to an extreme level. So, breaking news as of the time I'm recording this, which is February 9th, today the Leader has reported a submission of an attempted sexual assault allegation sent to current Fredonia President Collison against Dr. Stephen Kershnar. This report was submitted on February 4th by a former Fredonia student who alleges that the attempted assault took place in the early 2000s and is currently being investigated. Now, Kershnar has hired defense attorney Barry Covert, and I'm just going to quote the Leader here. Covert has received media attention for his work as a defense attorney for Christopher J. Belter Jr., who pled guilty to raping 4 teenage girls in his home. Although Belter faced 8 years of jail time for his crimes and was ruled a level 3 sex offender, Covert assisted his client into receiving no jail time. So, it looks like that joke about R. Kelly's defense attorney from earlier was more prescient than I expected. After all the people I've spoken to for this story, I can't say anything specific, but let me just say that I suspect that this complaint will not be the last of its kind. Again, these claims are hard to prove, but my heart goes out to the victims. He's still innocent until proven guilty, so please don't take this first report as a reason to not take action. Instead, think of it as a reminder why those of us who want him gone must take action and submit complaints. Back to the main video. Complaints related to the academic mission could range from the difficulty of scheduling courses to concerns about advising or concerns about the particular courses and the way that they're taught. Think about what umbrella your complaint falls under and then visit this link, which you can find in the description, where you can find the proper person to email your signed complaint with contact information into. And please, when you submit the information, please try to not be a dink to the hardworking people who are accepting the calls and answering the emails and reading the letters. Don't let the hurt that you feel from the situation become hurt that you pile onto somebody else, because that's just giving Kershnar what he wants. It's that type of wild outrage and pain that he's built his entire contrarian career upon, relying people to attack him for First Amendment things without giving due consideration to what if I complained about the horrendous academic things that are going on in his professorial career. Now, I'm not saying that the Fredonia administration is perfect here, quite the opposite. Many folks that I spoke to talked about how there are just clearly quite obviously broken parts of the administration, investigation, governance, and operation. But if you want to see Kershnar gone, you need to try. Keep up the pressure. Don't let them forget this. But remember that if you're willing to sign that change.org petition, or to tweet about this, or to post about it, that's okay, but your voice will not have 1,000th of the power that it could if you just submit a complaint at this link. You can send a complaint even if you're not a former or current student, but it means so much more if you are or were. Quadruply so if you yourself have been taught by Kershnar and have a specific actionable complaint about your experience learning from him.
Yo, and please remember, this is not John Oliver, dude, all right? This is not like some 30-minute, tightly crafted yuck joke fest where it ends with a call to action with breakdancing mascots and Jeff Goldblum wearing underpants on his head and doing wild impressions, man. If you want him gone, you got to do the thing.
So, that said, what's your best bet? What's our best shot at getting him gone? Well, I don't know. Because here's the thing. I personally am not on a crusade to get this man fired. I have interacted with this man, interviewed this man, seen this man debate, but I have personally not been one of his students. Do I personally think that he should be removed? Fuck yes, are you kidding, man? But I'm not gonna send you a script with exactly what to say, but other people are welcome to if they want. I know what I'm gonna complain about in my complaint that I send to Fredonia, but here's the thing. As much as I wrote and studied and put this video together, and as much of this is clearly my opinion, and Steve, if you're watching this wanting to sue me, just please remember that all of this whole video, well, this has just been a thought experiment. It's a hypothetical. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know this to be true. I'm just asking questions. I'm playing a character. I'm the devil's advocate, and we do live in a society, and oh, what's the matter, Steve? Steve, am I being
too challenging for you?
Anyway, I may have put all this information together, but I knew nothing about this until like 2 weeks ago. But people have been suffering in silence, and after I started posting about my perspective on this, my post got shared around, and dozens of people reached out to me of their own accord. People who have been suffering from Kershnar forever, or students just wanting to move on from this low point in their life, but who were still brave enough to reach out to me and tell me their story. Because this is their story too. And no one person alone can resolve this. So this ultimately isn't a story about me and what I think that you should do. It's a story about Fredonia. And quite frankly, I know that if you went there, then you're smart enough to make up your own decisions about what you think should happen, what you might want to say in a complaint. Do you think that there are grounds for him to be removed? Do you think that he should be removed? If so, what's wrong here? How are you going to formulate your own complaints? And where should you send it? Again, the links to send complaints to are here and in the description. Remember that up until this most recent apex of the Kershnar cycle, not a single actionable complaint has been submitted against him through the proper channels, at least to my knowledge. But I know that that can change. I've heard stories, many of whom didn't even want their stories to be referenced in this video for fear that Kershnar would come and track them down. But there is more of us than there has ever been. The community is on our side and the risk is lower than it's ever been because please know that me and the Fredonia community, we have your back. Perhaps the thing that leads to his removal is an experience somebody had that I don't even know exists yet. Although boy howdy have I already learned some things that seem pretty actionable to me. Either way, my heart goes out to all of those who have been hurt by Kershnar, whether they're students or colleagues. This video that you've watched is the work of dozens of people brave enough to come forward and share their stories. It's the power of a community willing to stand up because they just can't be silent anymore. It's up to you to decide what to do. And up to the current students at SUNY Fredonia who are going to be leading the protests and movements and organization from here. Please remember to support each other, to direct the energy where it counts, and to elevate each other's voices. And it'll be hard. Change always is. But I know that the students and faculty at Fredonia are up to the task. Because at the end of the day, in this moment, when the winds of change and public outrage and public opinion are finally on our side, only in this moment can we all as a community, maybe, finally, if we work together, find a way to break the Kershnar cycle. Wow, if you made it this far, I can't thank you enough. I know it's been a long video and there's been a lot to cover, so hopefully you found the journey worth it. Again, thanks to everybody who reached out, with special thanks going out to Anonymous, 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 and Anonymous. Huge thanks to Anonymous, 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 and Anonymous for providing the voices for the student quotes used in this video. If I got anything wrong, or if you want to share your story, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter @PaxLilin. And if you found this video impactful, please give it a share, because the wider we spread this information, the more impact we will have. And if you liked what you saw, please give the video a like and hit that subscribe button, because I have other videos coming out really soon that I'm super proud of, that I paused production on just to get this out as soon as possible. It's been my dream to make YouTube videos for a while now, and I'm really proud of how this one turned out, and I couldn't have done it without you all. So hopefully in the future I can do right by you all by releasing more useful videos. Much love to everybody who contributed their voices and their stories to this video. I hope you have an unbelievably awesome day, and I'll see you next time.